Okay, now that we're done with the old immigration period, we're going to take a look at the new immigration period, which is essentially from 1860 to 1920. Now, this wave of immigration is going to be twice as long as the old immigration period, and it's going to be decidedly different. It was one of the biggest waves of immigration that we've had in our history, and you'll be able to see that by the numbers later on. First of all, let's understand some of the basic geography. Remember, before the Civil War, 9 out of every 10 immigrants came from this region of Europe right here. And that really made up the entire wave of immigration during that time, 91%. But it's after the Civil War, or at the beginning of the Civil War and going for the next 60 years, that we see a distinct change in the immigration pattern. During the new immigration period, we're going to not see as many from here, and instead we're going to see a lot more from Southern Europe, down here, and heading up into Eastern Europe. It's these nations, these countries, that are going to start sending people to the United States from 1860 to 1920. Now, that's going to change things quite a bit because remember, in the old immigration period, everything was very white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, with the exception of the Catholics. But now, what you're going to see from Spain and from Italy are going to be waves and waves of more Catholics. That's the predominant religion in Southern Europe, in Spain and Italy, Portugal, places like that. They're also going to be much more darker complected than a standard white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. This also means that from around Greece, you're going to see a lot more Orthodox Christians and Muslims, again being darker complected than the standard white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. From Eastern Europe, you're going to see Slavic-speaking groups like Russians and Poles and Estonians and Latvians and Lithuanians and Czechs and Romanians and things along those lines. You're going to have different language groups, and you're going to see a lot more Catholics and Jews from those regions as well. And you're going to see Asian Buddhists. That's something we hadn't even talked about yet. You know, if you were white Anglo-Saxon Protestant and part of the old immigration period, you could somewhat relate to the people of Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. But the Chinese coming in, the Asian Buddhists, it's an entirely different religion. It's an entirely different way of dress. It's an entirely different appearance in terms of facial features, diet, language. Everything is vastly different in every way, and the old immigrants got pretty uncomfortable with that. So why did so many people from all over the world come to America after the Civil War? Well, the first thing is that Europe didn't seem to have any room for them, so they left by the billions. The European population was growing, and that meant increased amounts of fish, grain, and potatoes. But also, Europe was industrializing rapidly. So millions of people were leaving the agricultural life of the farms of rural Europe and heading for the cities and the factories. But there simply weren't enough jobs there to sustain them. So they had to leave. Many also were tired of being persecuted for their religion or their political beliefs, and they believed that if they came here, they would find the freedom to practice both of those without persecution. And some people were influenced by Americans who were already living here to come here as well. These were often known as the American letters. People who were already here writing to friends and relatives who were describing in those letters as America being the land of opportunity with cattle as fat as elephants and farmland as far as the eye can see. Come here and you can live your American dream. Now, many of the people who were writing these letters worked for industrialists who were looking for cheap labor. They figured if they could get family members from their workers to come over and then see them fail at their dream, well, they'd have a job waiting for them in a factory and wouldn't have to pay them much because they were immigrants. States were also convincing citizens to write American letters back to Europe to try to convince people to come because they wanted more population, specifically in the Midwest. So, as you can see on the chart here, onto America came 20 million people between 1860 and 1920. Mostly, as you can see here, from Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and Southern Europe. This new immigration period was going to be drastically different than the old immigration period that had come before it. In the 1860s and 1870s, there would be 2 million new immigrants each decade. And by the 1880s, there would be 5 million new immigrants. By the year 1882, there was an average of 2,100 immigrants coming in per day. The Statue of Liberty, as you can see here, went up in 1886 because of the waves of immigration and a gift from the French to welcome all these new immigrants to the country. And in the background, you can see Ellis Island here, which was opened in 1892 as a checkpoint for immigrants that were coming in. Immigrants by the millions passed through these hallways on their way to a new life in America. In New York City, where Ellis Island was located. And eventually, a West Coast version of Ellis Island was formed in San Francisco Bay called Angel Island. Many of these new immigrants were often uneducated, particularly in democracy, so many of them counted on their kids for their education in civics. Their kids would go to school during the day and come home and teach their parents about the Constitution and rights and the amendments and everything else. Essentially, their kids would teach them how to be an American citizen. The new immigration period also saw the rise of ethnic neighborhoods. Now, these had been in place to some degree before the Civil War. You know, you had Irish Town and you had Germantown in some places. But with so many different groups coming in now, the sheer number of ethnic neighborhoods absolutely exploded. The main reason is that immigrants couldn't always get help when they came to America, so the first place they would go would be someplace familiar where they knew the culture, the customs, the food, the language. They could get off the boat and go to a place where there were people just like them. And a lot of times that would make the transition easier. As more and more people came to America by the millions, more and more people kept finding comfort in ethnic neighborhoods, and those ethnic neighborhoods began to grow tremendously. Some classic examples that you can see here on the chart in front of you would include Germantown, Irish neighborhoods. Of course, among the most famous that you've heard of, I'm sure, would be Chinatown. The most famous one of those is in San Francisco, but there are Chinatowns in many major cities. Chinatown, even today, is kind of a staple of ethnic neighborhood culture. But there are other famous ones as well, such as Little Italy, located in most major cities, particularly New York, and other major cities as well. Here's a picture of Little Italy from New York back in the day. Irish Town was something that you usually found in high populations in Boston and also in New York. In some areas, you'd find a Greek town in some major cities. The most famous one, of course, is the one we all know in Detroit, Michigan. Manhattan's Lower East Side became known for Jewish culture. In particular, outstanding Jewish culture delicatessens with fantastic meats and breads. Later immigration in the 20th century would also include the barrio, the Hispanic neighborhood. Places like Miami would include Little Havana, which was a Cuban neighborhood named after the capital of Cuba. You can find Cuban neighborhoods in a lot of major cities and Hispanic neighborhoods in a lot of major cities, Little Havana in Miami being one of the most famous. And in the modern day, you can find various Muslim neighborhoods, particularly around the Detroit region. Muslim families, to a large degree, have assimilated themselves into American culture while maintaining their religious practices and beliefs. In certain places around Detroit, they are a large part of the civic community down there, and also make up 95% of the population at Detroit Dearborn Fordson High School. Here are Muslim members of the Fordson football team praying before a game.